What are primary and secondary sources in history, and how do we answer CTET questions based on this topic? Let's dig in. This is a question which is asked in the Pedagogy section of Paper 2 Social Science. And to answer this question, we need the answer to 4 questions, which is what is a source? What are the types of sources? Which are the sources which are mentioned in the NCERT? And how do we answer NCERT questions on this topic? The NCERT textbook for class 6 starts with this basic question from Rashida, who asks, how do we know what happened 100 years ago? We learn about what happened thousands of years ago from a source through historical sources. A source is something which provides us information about the period or the topic that we are studying. Needless to say, we as teachers or researchers have to ensure that the source that we are using, that it is authentic, that means it's a true source, and that is reliable, that means we can readily accept what it is saying. And for that, we have to use our judgment. A source can be of 3 kinds, but for the purpose of CTET, we are going to be looking at 2, that is the primary and the secondary source. But ideally, to understand this concept, you must know that a source is of 3 kinds, the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary. I'll go into detail about what are primary sources because that is the concept you need to understand. Plus, do understand that a secondary source is based totally on primary sources. So if somebody has picked up the primary sources and then rewritten or reanalyzed the entire thing, that's a secondary source. Whereas a tertiary source will depend on a secondary source for its input. So that's the difference between a secondary and a tertiary source. Let's first try and understand what is a primary source. So a primary source is a document or an artifact or anything that was created during the time or the period that we are studying or the incident that we are talking about. If it is information that we are talking about, then it has been physically collected at that time. There are various kinds of primary sources. Let's look into that. The most common one are physical artifacts. That means things which were made during that time. For example, so this is a picture of a burial site which has been shown in your history textbook. If we actually went there as a social science teacher, if I take my students to this site, then visiting this site would be a primary source. This is a seal, or this is something which is made from this fascians. If I actually take my students to a museum and show them this, those would be a primary source. Even maps. So documents could be a primary source. For example, this is a map. So this is that map made by Al-Idris somewhere in the 11th, 12th century. This would be a primary source. So how do we know what the world thought of India? We see this map and we say that yes, this is how India was visualized by others. So this would be a primary source. Now here's a picture from the map which was there in the 15th century where the French cartographer had made it. So how do we know what the world thought of India? This is a primary source. This is an inscription. So even reading this inscription, we know what was written, what was mentioned. So this becomes a primary source. In the same manner, we have pots, we have seals, we have so many things which are excavated from a site. They are all primary sources. This is the Sanchi Stupa. So if we take our students to Sanchi, then they can study about Buddhism and how they created things. It depends on what you're studying, whether you're talking about the period, if you're talking about architecture, if you're talking about art. If you really take them there, they become primary sources. This is a picture of a painting which has been shown. This is that famous picture where Timur has been shown with all the Mughal rulers. So that's how we know that they gave a lot of importance to their father's side, the Timurid side. Now, apart from physical artifacts such as songs, customs, costumes, the clothes that they wore, the food that they ate, if we have records of that. So all those would also be primary sources. Now, a major part of our primary sources come from written documents. Now, written documents could be of two types. One, it was written with the aim to publish it or with the aim knowing that somebody would read it. So, those could be books through which people try to bring about a lot of information about how places were that time or how things were that time. Examples of that would be in the medieval time, we had the Chinese travelers who had come in, Faxian and I Ching, and they had written their travelogues. We have Megasthenes who wrote about Chandragupta Maurya, so that's how we know what kind of a palace Chandragupta had. We have Abul Fazl's Akbarnama, through which we know about records about Akbar and what he did. We have those various prashastis and many, many more. So those are written documents, but remember that they were written with the intent that somebody else would read it. Another source of such written documents are public memos or legal documents. So the British used to keep a lot of records. If you take the Woods Dispatch, if you take Macaulay's Minute, those would also become primary sources. Then there are those various surveys that we have, the botanical surveys, the census, all those surveys which were conducted. A record of that, if we actually go and look at that record, those would be primary sources. So those are published written documents. There's another kind where we have written documents maybe, but they were not meant for publication. So they were not meant for other people to read. This could be letters which were written, this could be journals, this could be somebody's personal diary. These could have got published later, but the original intent was not publication. Apart from this, we have visual documentation or visual sources like photographs, films, posters, cartoons. So anything that was created during the period that we want to study, those are primary sources. Now, why are primary sources so important? They are important because they provide first-hand accounts of what actually happened. We see history from the perspective of the people who lived it or experienced it or took part in it. So it's very authentic. Now, to go back, secondary sources are written by experts, generally historians, who look through these primary sources and then they give us their interpretation or analysis. So, if we look at historians who have written the book like Romila Thapar's A History of India or an illustrated history of the world, all those would be secondary sources. In fact, the NCERT textbook is a very prime example of a secondary source. So as a teacher, you should be able to identify what are primary sources, what are secondary sources, and be able to choose or introduce children to the same. I'll move on now to examples from the NCERT textbooks. Some of these images I have shown you. If you go through the textbook, there are many. There are many paintings, and for everything a source has been put. But there are a few which I would like to point out so that from the exam point of view, you are very clear that whether this is a primary or a secondary source. So I'll start with James Mill's A History of British India, written in 1817. And that talks about, if we want to know how did the British look at Indians, that they divided us or divided history into Hindus, Muslims and British, then we know that that was how James Mill had portrayed it and penned it down. So that's the source for us to say that this is how they looked at us. Then if we want to know about how schools were functioning in the 19th century, we have William Adams' survey, that survey of local schools, when he went around, I think, to one entire presidency and checked out all the schools and said, here are the number of teachers, this is the caste of the students who came. So we know how education was taking place at that time. So that becomes a source. If things are listed that a survey by William Adam, you are expected to know what that survey is about. A few which are often mentioned are Amar Jibon by Rashundari Devi. So Amar Jibon is a book we could read, we could find out the status of women during that time. So she is a lady from Bengal who had written this at the age of 60, and she has given her life story. And we know how a lady from an upper caste, what kind of a life she would have lived. So that is something we would take as a primary source, depending on what is it that we want to study. Stri Purush Tulna by Tarabai is many a times mentioned, and that is an example of the gender inequality that women had. And again, maybe for gender inequality, status of women, what was the patriarchy at that time, we would take that up as a source. So now that the difference between a primary source and a secondary source is clear, let's move into few CTET questions. So the first question, the collection of weather information by using weather instruments is a form of dash resource. So when we are taking data through the instrument itself, that is, we are going to read that instrument and we are going to write down the weather information. So weather information could be wind pressure, humidity, temperature, whatever it is. If we are directly measuring it and noting it down, that's a primary source. On the other hand, we could be looking at the newspaper on a daily basis and we could be noting down what is the weather condition, was it cloudy, how much was the humidity. If we are going to go through weather information in that manner from the newspaper, then that becomes a secondary source. That is, the newspaper becomes a secondary source. The second question, the collection of weather information from the local newspaper is an example of which type of source? This was asked in 2018 social science paper. So this is a secondary source. A student was interested in understanding the problems faced by Indian soldiers during the Kargil war. She interviewed many soldiers who took part in the Kargil war. So the soldiers can be said to be primary sources. This is because they have taken part in the war. So although the soldiers are themselves not writing it, this lady has gone to them, she has asked them questions, she is writing it down. So the soldiers are primary sources. A teacher wants to assign a project on the partition of India based on primary sources. Which of the following is not a primary source? So in this you have to say which is not a primary source. We have oral history, we have newspaper archives, novels, and autobiographies. So the answer is novels, because oral history, if somebody is really talking about how partition took place, that would be primary. Newspaper archives, so we go back to the decade of 1940s and 50s and we find out about something, that's a primary source. Autobiographies written by people who might have been freedom fighters, they are writing it about themselves. So an autobiography would be a primary source. So novels would not be a primary source. A history teacher wants to teach his students about religious practices in Harappan civilization. Which of the following sources would be a primary source for? So the options are Early India, a book by Romila Thapar, a study on the religious practices of the Harappan civilization, a museum with a collection of artifacts from the Harappan period and fossils dated back to the Harappan period. So the answer is a museum with a collection of artifacts from the Harappan period. There are only two which come close. One is fossils dating back to the Harappan period, but by seeing fossils, I'm not sure how a child will understand the religious practices. A collection of artifacts, we are presuming this could be artifacts of based on religion. This would be a better answer. If we are looking at the study on the religion practices of Harappan civilization, then somebody has gone back, thought about it, seen sources. So this is a secondary source, whereas an early India book by Romila Thapar is also a book by a historian, and that's a secondary source. So the correct answer is a museum with a collection of artifacts from the Harappan period. A better answer would have been if they had written a collection of religious or artifacts based on religion, I guess, since they're talking about religious practices. But out of these four, three would be the best answer. To discuss educational practices in colonial India, which primary source would you rely on? So this is similar to that. So we have Rabindranath Tagore's Ghore Baire, that's a book by him, novel by him. James Mill's A History of British India, Jyotirao Phule's Gulamgiri, and Tarabai Shinde's Stri Purush Tulna. So the correct answer out here is Jyotirao Phule's Gulamgiri, because in Gulamgiri, Jyotirao Phule has talked about how the various castes and even women are not given education, And because of that, we have so many ill practices in the society. Jyotirao Phule has worked a lot for education. He set up the first school for women. He taught his own wife, Savitribai Phule. So his book would give us a lot of information about educational practices. Whereas if we look at Rabindranath Tagore's Ghore Baire, that's a novel, it's a story, it's fiction. James Mill's A History of British India talks about how India was based on its rulers, whereas Tarabai Shinde's book talks about gender inequality. It really does not get into education. The direct questions are very easy, but these kind of questions become a little difficult. Let's take one more. The writings of who among the following cannot be considered as a primary source? Muzaffar Alam, Abul Fazl, Rashundari Devi, and Ziauddin Barani. Now, if you look at this question, obviously there is one name you would not recognize. That is because Muzaffar Alam is a Delhi University professor and he is an expert who has been used for writing these textbooks. This is not a detail I expect you to remember because we really don't read the preface. But you do know the other three names. You know, Abul Fazl has written Akbarnama, Rashundari Devi has written Amar Jibon, and Yasuddin Barani mentioned as a writer. So, since these three will become primary sources, we will go with Muzaffar Alam. Similarly, somebody else's name could also have been given. It has been given in some question where Dr. Krishna Kumar's book was written. He is also another Delhi University NCRT professor. So that's how you need to tackle this kind of question. Which of the following can be treated as a secondary source for a social science class? Photographs from earthquakes in Bhuj and its descriptions, edited volumes of articles on Akbarnama, Jawaharlal Nehru's letters to Indira Gandhi, and Mahatma Gandhi's book Hind Swaraj. So, if we are looking at secondary source, then the edited volumes on the articles of Akbarnama, because this is not the Akbarnama that we are reading, we are looking at the edited volumes. So, that would become a secondary source. I hope you found this useful and I hope that this topic was clear for you. Do let me know in the comments below about any other topic that you would like me to do. Thank you for watching.